an old adage in teaching, especially in early childhood kinds of stuff, right? The question is like, when should I bring this up? You should bring it up when the students bring it up. If students bring it up or asking questions about it, they're ready to talk about it. So one of our great flaws in the way that we do history, particularly in the actual authentic history of the United States, and I've actually even heard arguments that it's important that we teach the mythology of the United States so that when you get to undergrad and you meet the hippie like me that explains the reason we even have a country is because of 10 years of really bad tobacco crops, staggering debt to the Bank of England, and the easiest way to get out of that debt was to just nullify it and create your own existence outside of England and outside of the UK. Hence why are there so many people from Virginia that signed the Declaration of Independence, right? This is about getting out of debt, not, you know, these rhetorical flourishes of freedom and independence and I don't want to pay that much for my tea. What nonsense, right? This is about getting out of debt. This was always about money. This was always about capitalism. So how do I approach this in terms of a US history teacher? I think one of our greatest assets that's well keeping in the standards, keeping within NCSS, keeping within state standards, is to read authentic texts, right? I'm not like pretending that people like Harry Truman were white supremacists. I have really, really, really strong and compelling evidence. I have things that he himself wrote down while he was president. Primary sources are your best friend, not only because it's what real history is, right? And what real, you know, in a lot of ways, social scientific research is all about, you know, examining evidence, analyzing evidence, right? Those are the skills that you build in social studies classes in K-12 spaces. So authentic texts, primary sources are an absolutely wonderful strategy here. I think another way into it is teaching perspective taking. It might be important to know that lots of people celebrate Columbus as like this great guy who was sort of an idiot, but he just decided to go the wrong way to get to India, and he met all of these other people, and so he assumed they must be Indian, and that's why we still call indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere Indians. And we could think about that as a particular kind of perspective. Now, let's think about 3 other ways that we could view Columbus. A fun activity, right? Like, what would their mom say about them, right? I love that prompt for a historical figure. What do you think Genghis Khan's mom thought about Genghis Khan? So perspective taking, right? How did the indigenous people, right? How did the Carib people respond? What would be the kinds of things you'd be worried about? And you know, if you were hearing all these words that you couldn't really understand, and then it seemed like they were pointing to gold over and over and over again, and you didn't really have any, how would you have responded? And so when I'm doing that, right, I'm actually sort of ameliorating some different kinds of pieces. I'm still learning the mythology of the United States. I'm learning things about, like, you know, George Washington felt so bad after he chopped down that cherry tree that he had to go tell the truth because George Washington could never tell a lie. And maybe that's kind of fun, right? But it's really fun to ask a question after that, like, why would it feel important for George Washington to never be able to lie? Like, who would care about that? Why would that matter? And those are the kinds of ways, right, where I can be hitting even the most, like, you know, America first kinds of raw social studies standards like they teach in Texas, and at the same time, be building that critical capacity, be examining those primary sources, be looking at these kinds of things and asking, what kinds of perspectives are these asking of me? I was in this fantastic 5th grade classroom, a teacher, a former student of mine, somebody I worked with for years, and her activity that she was doing with her students, they were looking at the very, very front of their social studies textbook in 5th grade. Because the front of lots of these K-12 books, right, has different pictures of the different people that contributed to the book. And so the prompt was just, what do you think we could learn about this text based on who wrote it and who contributed to it? And the 5th graders were saying really remarkable things like, well, it's all but one person was white, and that might make a difference, right? And somebody else said, like, there's, you know, there's no Asian people. And so maybe the ways that they talk about Asian people won't be as accurate because there's no Asian people. 5th graders are doing that kind of critical consciousness raising kinds of work that we hope for from social studies. So I always want to push back on anybody who thinks the standards, right, or assessment is going to disallow you from doing authentic history. The challenge, right, or sort of the thing that we need to do is to go right? To do every single thing that we're asked to do so that we can do all the things that we want to do.
I think it's interesting, standing back, sort of looking at it from the political science perspective. When Common Core was being debated, what was the subject that was most controversial? History. Localities, by God, they didn't want, you know, they didn't want San Francisco's historical perspective in Waco, Texas, right? So history has always been kind of a lightning rod for conveying values that parents and politicians and so on consider important. And so I think the first thing you have to do is stand back and say, why are we teaching history? And there's the old adage that if you don't understand history, you're going to repeat it. And that couldn't be truer, right? So that on the most simple level, you study history to learn from it. Another role that it gets is, content, that it's important that we, can name the presidents in order and so on and so forth. If you're real content oriented, then, that you're going to do better on the standardized test, or, every citizen should be able to rattle off whatever, what dates the Civil War occurred, whatever. So if you're expecting history to deliver that, think through, why are we doing that when we can Google all that information these days? And then, of course, the socialization piece, that we expect American history to turn out students that have a warm, fuzzy feeling about the country in the same way that we have a warm, fuzzy. I mean, it's not just a warm, fuzzy, but it's a particular warm, fuzzy feeling that we want to hand down from generation to generation. So that they'll charge the beaches in Normandy or whatever we want them to be ready to do. Or if in fact education is moving away from content and more towards skills and critical thinking and problem solving, we can do both. We can incorporate some of these facts, not make them the be all and end all of standardized testing, but we can also use them as a springboard to take on, much more challenging and interesting questions. What if everybody had the vote from the beginning of the United States? How might our history have developed? Those are the kind of things we probably should be doing in a world where we can Google facts at our fingertips, right? Now, does that meet all of those other values that I was describing before? Not going to do well on the existing Pearson standardized test. It's not going to socialize kids to, say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of class and not ask any questions about some of the language in it. It's funny, countries that have these sort of rituals that we don't like, we call it indoctrination. But when they have the ones we do like, we call it socialization. At what level are we really trying to indoctrinate these kids? Are we trying to make them free thinkers and so on? And we need to answer those questions before we decide, what history books we're going to have them be reading.
I like the Frankfurt School attitude about lots of these kinds of things. The question isn't if we should indoctrinate people. The question is how and toward what end do we indoctrinate people, right? All education, all language really is a form of indoctrination. The question is its orientation, right? What is it for? Whose purposes is it serving? Who's being excluded from it? Hearing you talk, Mark, I'm thinking about Thomas Jesse Jones and the origins of even why we have to call it social studies and not history, right? Because the purpose of social studies is civic participation, right? The aim is for everybody to vote, right? And to have patriotic feeling, to be attached to this invented nation that is the United States. Not to have a robust and authentic history and historical understanding of events that have led to and produced our current status quo. No, the point is a civic understanding, a patriotic understanding, and hence it's social studies instead of history that way, right?